It's quite an audacious and perhaps even ridiculous claim when you think about it, to think that the birth of a baby to an unwed teen amid the squalor of a backwater town named Bethlehem could possibly matter. And yet that's precisely the paradox of Christmas. The paradox of Christmas is that the birth of this baby in a barnyard does matter. In fact, one could even say that the hope of the whole world rests upon his shoulders. Let us pause for a moment to pray. Most gracious God, in the beauty of this night, in the midst of this holy moment, as the world goes on around us, often filled with bad news and threats and regrets, Lord, we gather here tonight because you promise us hope in the midst of what seem to be hopeless situations. Lord, you promise us light in the midst of the darkness. And so we are here, dear God. We are here to hear again that story that travels into our deepest thoughts and minds, to be comforted again by that story that we know so well. So Christmas is full of paradoxes, or I might have to ask one of the English teachers in the choir, is it paradoxes or paradoxi? Paradoxes, okay. Paradoxes. The first paradox is this. It's the paradox between the nostalgic and sentimental way that we think about the birth of the Christ child, an almost Hallmark card picture, if you will, versus the reality and even the harshness of the actual situation. I mean, we send these sentimental cards of nice little angelic nativity scenes with a nice cleaned up baby lying comfortably in what looks to be a manger full of warm, comfortable straw. But in fact, the reality of the situation is that Mary and Joseph were essentially homeless. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to stay, and so they ended up in a dusty, dirty barnyard, where Mary apparently goes into labor in the midst of unclean and unsanitary conditions. Now, if you think about it, there is nothing at all nostalgic about that picture. It's more like raw reality TV than a Hallmark card. And in fact, if we turn the nativity story into a nostalgic, sentimental Hallmark moment, I'd like to suggest tonight that we take away all of its theological power and significance. Because the whole point of the Christmas story is that God is willing to come into the midst of this world under the harshest and most unexpected conditions. The whole point of the Christmas story is that God comes down from heaven and becomes flesh, not in the midst of comfort, not in the midst of the palace of the emperor, but in the midst of the most dreary of circumstances. God enters the world in this nowhere place called Bethlehem to a bunch of nobodies and misfits, precisely to demonstrate God's overwhelming love for all the world. And so if we allow this story to become too tame and too nostalgic and too sentimental, then this story loses all of its theological power and implications. in fact, God comes to the fellowship of the forgettable. God comes to the fellowship of the forgettable. Mary and Joseph and the shepherds. They were most likely uneducated. They probably smelled bad. And they were considered lower class. This is not a sentimental story. It's a harsh, real-life reality story with great hope and promise for folks like you and me. And the second way that we allow the paradox of Christmas to be stripped of its meaning is that we remove it from its social historical context. You see, God entered the world at a particular time and a particular place, precisely to demonstrate God's desire to transform the bad news of the world into the good news of God's kingdom. So God came into the world in the midst of the Roman occupation of Palestine, and God came not as one of the powerful and the mighty, but as one of the weak and lowly. God came into the world not because everything was going great, but because things were going terribly wrong. God came into the world to change the world, not to keep the status quo. God came into the world because God's people, you and me, were broken and struggling, not because we had it all together. How often at Christmas time do we want everything to be perfect? We want to have perfect decorations, perfect presents, perfect food, perfect parties, perfect family gatherings where Uncle Joe doesn't get drunk, and where there's not an argument that breaks out between the Ravens fans and the Steelers fans. But you know what? God doesn't come to the world to admire our perfection. God didn't come into the world to admire our perfection. God came into the world to be with us in the midst of our imperfections and in the midst of our suffering, and to redeem the suffering of the world. And so, in a way, when we gather tonight to sing sentimental songs that make us feel good, and to bask in the glow of the candlelight, and to enjoy the ambiance of a perfect worship service, where there was no one who sang off-key, where there was no musician who played the wrong note, where there was no reader or lector who stumbled over a word. If that's why we're here tonight, then we miss the point. We miss the point that God came into the midst of a broken world. God came into the harsh reality of homelessness and oppression to suffer with those who suffer and to bring hope into the midst of hopelessness. But then again, maybe that's why we become all sentimental in the first place. Precisely because God's grace and love and mercy stand in such stark contrast to the broken lives that we all live, in the broken world that we all live in. God's grace and love and mercy stands in such contrast to the world that we can't help but sentimentalize it. We sentimentalize that peace and love and acceptance and joy that we all yearn for in the midst of our brokenness. Because in fact that is the promise of the gospel. That God regularly shows up where we least expect God to be. That God shows up at the point of our deepest need, not to applaud our greatest deeds. And though the world seems dark, it is not forgotten nor forsaken, because God comes to us precisely in the midst of this darkness. And while the headlines that we read in the morning from the newspapers and worry about, those headlines will continue to have their day, but ultimately they will fade in the background, in the backdrop of this story that we've been telling for over 2,000 years. That God so loved the world, that God sent his Son Jesus. That God so loves the world that God will not give up on it or on us. That God continues to come into the midst of the darkness of this world over and over and over again to bless it and to bring light into the midst of this darkness. And so it seems to me that this is precisely the paradox of Christmas. We yearn for this perfect world and this perfect life and these perfect services, but that's not why God comes. God comes to the midst of our brokenness that God might show us the way. That somehow one little beacon of light from one little baby in a barnyard in Bethlehem offers the power and the promise to change the world. Brothers and sisters, as we gather in the midst of the beauty and the darkness and the paradox tonight, I confess to you that I do not pretend to understand it. I do not pretend to understand this paradox of Christmas, but I do believe it. Because I see the hope and the promise of this Christ child at work in the world every day. In the deeds of love and mercy that you as members of this congregation and as visitors, whatever you do and whatever daily task God calls you, that in the deeds of love and mercy that you perform, we see the hope of Christ alive. That in the mission and ministry of this congregation, in feeding hundreds of people week after week, in celebrating and joining in worship with hundreds of people week after week, I see the hope of the Christ child. And so I believe it, even though I do not pretend to understand it. And I yearn for it in the deepest crannies of my soul. And perhaps you do too. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's why you're here tonight as well. To celebrate this very sentimental story, which is so special and so true. My brothers and sisters, that's why we gather this night. It's a paradox. It doesn't make sense, not from our human standpoint, but from the perspective of God, it makes all the sense in the world. God was born this night to come into the midst of the brokenness of our world and to give us hope. May the God who comes into this world bring you all light and life, mercy